Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Some of you might have expected Nick Verstraeten instead of me. Nick is actually somewhere in an airport because of cancelled flights, so I'm taking over. This is the agenda for today. A short introduction on Solventure, who we are and what we do. Then I want to, before we really dig into how to manage and optimize inventory, I want to spend some time on why we believe or why we see that inventory on the one hand has become increasingly important in many companies, and what are also some challenges when managing inventories or reducing inventories. As a third topic, or a fourth topic actually, we will dig into multi-echelon inventory optimization, which is a somewhat more advanced inventory topic. I want to briefly introduce how it is different and what type of experience we have there as Solventure. And then Dan will give a short demo on the Archiva capabilities when it comes to single echelon inventory. And we will pause at the end for some of your questions. So, short introduction of Solventure, who we are, what we do. As you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, we are basically experts in S&OP and gradually changing that into Strategy Driven S&OP. The left really shows the different building blocks of a good S&OP process that is described in detail in a vision paper, which we call Our Vision on S&OP. If you want to read it, please reach out to us after this webinar. The different steps, segmentation, product management, demand, inventory, supply, exec S&OP are described there in detail. And today we will focus on inventory planning, inventory management, inventory optimization. That will be the key focus point today. How do we do that? Working on that S&OP in a combination of people, process, tools, and analytics. So we are not a traditional management consultancy company which only gives the advice. We are also not a traditional software company which only delivers the software. We really try to combine the process knowledge on how to set up, for instance, your forecasting process, or how to set up an inventory planning or inventory management process, how to combine that with tooling. The tooling we use is the Archiva tooling shown on the right. Archiva is headquartered in the US, Wilmington, Delaware, has offices in Belgium, Antwerp, and in India, Mangalore. Their software has been listed by Gartner, has been listed by Supply Chain Insights. So I think it's one of the key systems you need to review if you want to invest in S&OP software. So we give the process advice, we use the Archiva tooling. We have a lot of analytical knowledge. If you look at demand, you can do statistical forecasting. If you look at inventory planning, as we will do today, you need statistical inventory models. All these type of analytical capabilities is something we have and we develop in our consultant base. And we also focus on the people, because very easily you can have the best process and the best tool and the most clever algorithms, but if the planners are not trusting it, they will not use it. So change management is also key in any project we do. The different steps in the S&OP process map to different modules in the Archiva software. So there is a module which is really focused on segmenting customers and products, shown here on the left. We have a module which is focused on product management, which is basically how do I, in an orderly fashion, introduce new products, and how do I make sure that sufficiently in time I take all products out. So that's the product management or the product lifecycle management. A separate step in your S&OP process to be supported by a separate module in your S&OP software. Anything that has to do with collaborative demand planning, inventory planning and optimization, supply planning at different levels of detail, rough cut, DRP, MPS up to detailed scheduling, and then the exec S&OP. And here again in the webinar today, we will talk about inventory piece. You can also see here at the bottom, Archiva is a software which works on top of the ERP system. So basically the transactional data and the master data is residing in the ERP system. It means we need to be able to easily get data out of the ERP and easily get the results of the planning decisions back in the ERP, because the ERP is typically also used for the execution follow-up. And we do have a powerful connector which does allow for an easy integration between Archiva as a tooling and your ERP system or your different ERP systems, because many companies do have a fragmented ERP landscape. These are some of our references, some of our customers. You will really see that we work across different sectors. I also often say to our customers, we also bring the best expertise from each of the sectors to you. If you look at a company like Federal Mogul, which is in the automotive aftermarket, if you have 100,000 SKUs and you have them at multiple locations, yeah, that's a really specific inventory problem. So typically from different sectors, we draw different types of expertise, and we really bring the best of that expertise to your specific situation and to your specific challenge. That's how we try to bring knowledge and competence to you as a customer. So let's start with the question, why is inventory important, or why do we see that companies want to work on inventory optimization? Well, I will get back to a book I've written last year and which got published actually in May this year, and the book is here at the bottom right. The book is called Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics. And in that book, the struggle with inventory is summarized by this supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. And we believe two things. One is that for us, supply chain management is about balancing this triangle of service, cost, and cash. And two, we also believe that a lot of companies heavily struggle with balancing this supply chain triangle. Before we dig into the struggle, let's clarify each of the corners. On the one hand, cost typically speaks for itself. So warehousing, logistics, manufacturing, purchasing, any type of operational costs. The cash side of the triangle, well, cash is, in a more broad sense, working capital. And working capital consists of the receivables, the payables, and the inventory. So the receivables is the money that you still need to collect from the customers. The payables are amounts you still need to pay to your suppliers. And then, of course, we have the inventory. And if your working capital increases with 10 million, it's basically 10 million extra cash which you need to invest in. So either you need to draw it from the bank account, or you will need to get a loan from the banks or from shareholders to be able to accommodate that increase in working capital. Likewise, if I can reduce my working capital with 10 million, it basically means that, for instance, if I reduce the inventory with 10 million, I can sell off 10 million euro or $10 million worth of goods. It will basically mean that I will get 10 million extra on the bank account. So working capital and inventory is a part of the working capital, is synonym here with cash. And I will come back to the point that we see that since the financial crisis, a lot of companies have been much more cash aware. So generating cash by lowering inventories or by lowering working capital has been an important initiative in many companies over the last 5 to 10 years. Then we have the service side of the triangle. When you think about service, you really need to take a broad perspective. So service on the one hand is your on time in full delivery performance. So what is my lead time towards the customer, and what is the reliability on that promised lead time? So these two aspects are typically summarized in the on time in full. But it also has to do with, for instance, the product portfolio. How broad is your product portfolio? If I have a broader product portfolio, a broader assortment with more choice for the customer, that's also an aspect of service. Or if you look at your order flexibility, can any customer at any time order in any quantity? Or are there certain restrictions like minimum order quantities or minimum lead times? Also, this defines your level of service. Or even consignment stocks. If I finance part of the inventory at my customer, it's also a type of service I deliver. In this case, it's a financial service. So when you think service in this triangle, it's important that you really take a broad definition or a broad perspective. So once we understand the principles of the triangle, let's see a couple of examples on why we believe companies struggle. Well, what we see is that companies, for instance, start sourcing in the Far East. Why do you do that? Because typically it leads to a lower purchasing cost. At the same time, because you have longer lead times will result in a higher safety stock, and potentially also the quality control of incoming goods or imported goods can be more difficult. So you might also have more issues with, let's say, stock which is out of specification. So in general, sourcing in a low-cost country can be good for the cost, but it can negatively impact your inventory position. So it can be bad for the cash. Second example, if you are in marketing or in sales and you have a target to increase the market share, how do you increase the market share? Well, maybe you take the initiative to expand the product portfolio. Well, if you expand the product portfolio, let's really hope that the customer sees that as an improved service because of an improved choice. But again, if you introduce new products and you extend a product range, not all of these products will be equally fast moving. In fact, you risk introducing what we call a long tail. It means a long tail, many products, which maybe give a complete or full range offering, but that tail becomes slow moving. If you have a slow moving long tail, it will negatively impact your inventory position. You will need inventory, more inventory, or your inventory turns will actually go down. Third example, because inventory in many companies makes huge swings, and because typically finance has become more concerned about the inventory position because inventory is equal to cash, we've seen in many companies inventory reduction programs being launched. So typically if at the end of December the inventory was way higher than was targeted in the budget, the CFO will be unhappy, the CEO will be unhappy. So most probably we then start the new year in January by launching a major inventory reduction program. Those type of programs might have multiple projects. We see that companies do not necessarily have enough resources to staff all of these projects. So it means that maybe we want to launch 10 projects to only find out 3 or 4 months later that out of the 10 projects, only 3 really kicked off. And then to even see like around July, August, that of the 3 or 4 projects that actually got launched, none of them is really giving the anticipated inventory benefits. So what do we then do around September, October? We start panicking, we resort to the handbrake, and the handbrake in inventory management is lowering the safety stocks. What happens if you lower the safety stock? Well, lowering the safety stocks for sure will reduce the inventory. That's a good news, but the bad news is if you just lower your safety stocks, you will also negatively impact your service. And if you negatively impact your service, you will get all kinds of operational firefighting costs, which basically are trying to close the gap. So this is just a couple of examples on why we believe companies struggle with balancing this supply chain triangle. How does that come that we struggle with the balance? Well, if this is a typical organization chart, if you are responsible for sales and marketing, your first thought of the day will most probably be about market share, sales turnover, or sales, net sales. If you are in purchasing, most probably your first thought of the day will be about the cost. How can I buy more volume while spending less money? If you are in production, then your first thought of the day might be efficiency, because the efficiency in production is driving the manufacturing cost. And it really means, if you look at how different departments and their focus and their KPIs translate into the supply chain triangle, you get something like the following. We see that in most companies, salespeople are primarily service oriented. You could say they represent the customer within our organization, and they will do whatever it takes to get an order out of the door and to get something sold. So they heavily pull the service side of that triangle. Operations is typically relatively cost oriented or cost focused. And they are primarily then pulling that cost side of the triangle. And in some companies, that is where it stops. You have like an eternal debate between sales and operations. And if these guys are discussing, typically the inventory can make huge swings as a result. But then the CFO came into play, who said, guys, I have enough of the inventories going up and down. I now want us to play this game with a lower inventory and with a constantly lower inventory. No swings in the inventory, please. And because the CFO does not necessarily understand a lot about inventory, he will look for a victim, and that victim on the chart here is the VP of supply chain. So he will say to the VP of supply chain, dear VP of supply chain, you will manage the inventory for me, and your target is to reduce the inventory with 20%. And as a supply chain person, you need to be very careful here, because reducing the inventory with 20% is actually about bringing balance in this triangle. So bringing balance in this triangle is not a light task or not a light challenge. Is it important to balance the triangle? Yes, because if you take the investor's perspective towards this triangle, I would say, well, service is most probably a driver for the top line, for the net sales. If I improve my service, I expect it will lead to more sales. If you improve the service and it's not leading to more sales, then you need to question why you do it. But as an investor, I'm not only interested by the top line or by the sales, I also want to see a margin. Here, the good news is if you combine the service side of the triangle with the cost side of the triangle, or the top line with the cost, you get to a bottom line, for instance, EBIT. And as an investor, I'm even not only concerned with the margin, or not only concerned with something like EBIT. And why is that? If I have two companies which generate 100 million of EBIT, a first company requires only 50 million of cash, the second company requires 100 million of cash, then most probably I prefer to do the first investment twice. So as an investor, it's really about what's the EBIT you generate over the invested cash or over the invested capital. And in financial terms, that is called the return on capital employed. In spoken language, it's about the bang for the buck. If I invest €1 or $1, what do you give me as a return, as a margin? So there is a good reason to really balance that triangle. And the reason is that balancing the triangle is about optimizing the value for the shareholder value measured here as the return on capital employed, or in spoken language measured as the bang for the buck. And how do you then bring that balance into that triangle? Well, our strong belief is that basically balancing that full triangle, you do that with an integrated S&OP process. So if you really want to balance the full triangle, you do need a good S&OP process with each of the steps here. We will zoom in today on the inventory planning piece. But if you want to come to an integrated approach, you really need all of the steps. That's why we have put the steps of the S&OP over here, and where we have put balance in that triangle really here in the middle of what we do. That's also basically what we do as a company. We help you to balance this triangle. We help you to generate shareholder value as a result. And how do we do that? We basically do that using S&OP and implementing S&OP in companies. So now let's dig into inventory planning. So how to manage and optimize inventory, or how does inventory as a piece of the puzzle fit into the broader S&OP process? Well, if we want to manage and optimize inventory, we need to start by understanding inventory and what is inventory and what is driving inventory. And that is basically what is summarized in this relatively simple graph. It shows 5 main reasons to hold inventories. And it leads to different types of inventory. The first one on top is cycle stock. And cycle stock is a result of your production or ordering frequency. If I produce only once per month, then by default, on average, I already have 2 weeks of inventory. If I produce once a week, that will result in, on average, half a week of inventory. That is basically the cycle stock. Beneath, you see the safety stock. Safety stock is a buffer to absorb uncertainty on the demand and the supply. If I work forecast driven, we all know there is only one truth about forecasting. It is that the forecast will be wrong. The question is how wrong? And if we can measure the forecast error, we can basically cover for the error by putting safety stock. The safety stock can be demand driven. It can be due to the forecast error, or even if I would use a pull system where it's really demand driven, then I start from the natural demand uncertainty. But safety stock can also be supply driven. If I say, well, if I ask production to produce 100, I'm uncertain what quantity I will actually get. Why? Because maybe they produce less or more because of their efficiency. It could also be due to quality processes. If you say it needs to go to a quality review and part of it can be rejected or cannot be rejected. There can also be supply uncertainty. Also, that supply uncertainty needs to be covered in the safety stock, because if I order 100 and I get only 80, well, if I still want to keep selling, I will need some safety stock to buffer for the case that 20 difference would occur in the supply. If we go further down, anticipation stock, we say there to absorb foreseen unbalance between supply and demand. And an example could be a shutdown. If I have a shutdown of 2 weeks, I know I will need to pre-build some inventory. Another example could be seasonal stock. If I have a seasonal demand and my peak capacity is lower than the peak demand, then again, I will need to pre-build stock. And we call that anticipation. It's basically an unbalance which we can foresee. And where do we foresee that? Well, that's typically a result from the supply planning process. So if you would have a rough cut capacity planning process, seasonal stocks, shutdowns would typically already be tackled in the RCCP process and be known a couple of months in advance. And so this inventory is typically decided upon in your supply planning process, for instance, in the RCCP process. I can also have in process or in transit stock. If I ship goods by boat from China into Europe or into the US, I can easily, if I do it by boat, I can easily have like 4 weeks of inventory which are on the boat. If I have a manufacturing process which is quite labor intensive, maybe an assembly process, there can also be a lot of inventory which is really on the production floor. This is called work in process. Work in process or work in progress is also in process stock. If I want to manage this inventory, well, first of all, it will have to do with lead times. If instead of shifting things by boat, I ship them by air, that will of course affect lead times and inventories, but it will also affect cost. So then I'm again in that triangle. I can also work on those type of inventories by process efficiency. So if you're in your operations, you would do lean manufacturing. Well, typically improving the process efficiency will help you to get a better service at the end of the manufacturing process, with shorter throughput times and typically also with less work in process sitting on the manufacturing floor. So this is an example again of a different type of inventory, and different types of inventories need to be addressed and worked on in a different way. At the bottom, we see strategic stock. And we say that in general, it's put there for strategic reasons. What could be strategic reasons? Well, we expect a shortage in the market. A shortage could be either in raw materials. A shortage could also be in your demand market. So you say, I expect that one of my competitors potentially is going bankrupt. If he would be going bankrupt and can no longer sell, I want to have a strategic stock of my finished product ready so that I can immediately take over his customer. Strategic stock typically for me is uncertain. There is a degree of uncertainty. I'm not really sure that this will happen. And it's more like a hedging or a risk management. That's why I put that inventory. And I'm not too hung up on what is now strategic stock and what is anticipation stock. I am hung up on, do have that debate in your company. It's very important that with purchasing, with sales, with finance, you sit together and you clarify what are really the drivers for our inventory and how do we give them a name and how do we identify these inventories in a way that makes sense for us. Because the reason to split up your inventory in different levels is the following. I come into companies where the inventory went up with 10%, I don't know, from January to March, and 10% could be it went up with 30 million or it went up with 40 million, and nobody in the company can really explain why. Well, if you cannot explain why your inventory went up with 40 million, then you have a big issue. Well, why it went up, well, needs to be explained by clarifying what are the drivers and through which processes will we decide whether to increase or decrease a given layer in the inventory. And coming back now to the strategic stock, for me, that would typically be an S&OP decision where, I don't know, either sales or either purchasing says, we expect a shortage here or there, and we want to put a strategic buffer into place. The required investment in cash is, I don't know, 10 million, 20 million. Dear CFO, do you agree with this? Are we willing to spend the cash to hedge this strategic risk we might occur? So clearly identify what are the different layers. Also clearly identify which is the process where we will decide whether to do it or not to do it, whether to increase or decrease, and at which point in time. And that will give you more clarity on if my inventory went up from January to March with 30 million, what is actually driving that. If we look at the inventory module of Arqiva or an inventory module of an advanced planning system in general, the inventory module typically starts here. It gives you better inventory parameters for your planning system. You see here that supply planning, RCCP type of processes, and even S&OP might decide on inventories as well. So if you want to have an integrated management of your inventory, you need to have a fully integrated S&OP process. The inventory module on which we zoom in today, basically one of the inputs it gives is here, what are good inventory parameters. And I will explain a bit more in detail what else is typically covered in that inventory module. But I hope you will keep this in mind when you try to work on your inventories. Clarify what are the different reasons to hold inventories, what are the different drivers of inventory, and which process is deciding on which specific driver. The inventory framework, so a couple of steps. When we deploy inventory as part of the S&OP process, it starts with inventory policies. So what are target service levels? Will we put stock, yes or no? Is it MTS, MTO? Is it stock? Is it non-stock? Central, decentral. If you have both a central warehouse and a decentral warehouse, which items do I put on stock where? And also reordering policies, like will I work forecast driven, or do I want to go to a pull concept, which is basically starting from a reorder point or a min-max type of philosophy. Lately, there has been a lot of talk about demand-driven MRP. Demand-driven is a pull type of concept. Well, all those type of decisions, like where do I put the decoupling point, all of these decisions for us fit under the umbrella of the inventory policy. Once I have decided which items to stock, which items not to stock, where to stock them, and how to differentiate service levels, we can start calculating inventory parameters. So there, Arqiva has a statistical engine and has multiple options to calculate safety stocks, to calculate lot sizes, and as a result of these two, also reorder points, min-max levels, which you can feed into your planning engine, typically a master planning engine. The tool will make a proposal, but we always allow overrides. That's one of our firm beliefs as a process, that you need powerful analytics to give a good starting point, but planners or salespeople, whether it's about inventory or demand, they need to be able to make overrides. What could be reasons to make overrides? Yeah, maybe contractual agreements. Yeah. In theory, you can work with 5 days of safety stock, but the agreement with the customer is that we will have 20. Well, once it's agreed, we will put the 20. In the next contract negotiation, we will challenge the customer and we say, we are okay to guarantee safety stock, but you don't need 20. We will only put 5. So the interaction between the analytics and the process, that's really also required to come to a good buy-in or to a good change process. Multi-echelon, we will dig in a little bit more detail in a minute or so. Once I have my inventory parameters, we come to inventory planning. And what are typical steps in inventory planning? A first step is to make it time dependent. So if you calculate a safety stock, typically you start based on the past. If you do it on forecast error, you will look, okay, historically, what has been the error on this product? If you do it on demand variability, you will start from historically, what has been the variability on this product, and then you want to extrapolate that to the future. How do we typically do it? We start from the past and we say, okay, if this was the variability, then typically, historically, we needed 5 days or 7 days or 25 days. And then going forward, we will use that 25 days or that 20 days and the forecast to propose a kind of time-dependent safety stock. So we can project the safety stock going forward. You can get into more technical discussions like, do I just use the forecast or do I use an average forecast of the next 2 or 3 months to smoothen out a little bit changes in the forecast? All of those are detailed discussions we typically have when we really implement the module. Once I have a projected safety stock, cycle stock, here I can also define strategic stock. If I say, well, this is kind of my minimal or target inventory, but in those 2 months or in those 3 months, I really want to insert a strategic buffer to buffer the demand risk or the supply risk. That's typically also where you inject it. So once that inventory has been projected into the future, I can easily say, well, in those 3 months, I want to have 30,000 units or 10 million or 5 million extra in those products or in those product groups. That's where you add it. That is the input to your capacity constraint planning. For instance, the RCCP plan. It could also be an LP-based plan where you define the anticipation stock. So if there is demand supply unbalance, I need to pre-build inventory. That pre-building inventory or that anticipation stock will be a result of your planning process. The result here is that you can show the projected inventory. You can show what's typically safety stock, what cycle stock, what is really strategic stock, which we have decided upon in an S&OP process, and what's anticipation stock, which is the result of the planning process. And we can also show the cash flow impact, because if at some point in time our inventory increases with 5 million, we know that will need to be financed. That 5 million will need to come from somewhere. So first, policy making. Once you have the policies, you know which items to put on stock, which not, what are the service levels. We calculate the inventory parameters. Once we have the inventory parameters, we can use the forecast to translate that in a plan going forward. We can add strategic stock. That will be the input to your supply planning process, and then we really get the projected inventory with different layers and the cash flow impact. All of this is still planning, and if you plan for an inventory of 10 pieces, again, the only thing you are sure is that you will not end up with 10 pieces. You will either end up with 5 or end up with 0, or you could also end up with 20. And how come? Well, it comes because of the forecast is not perfect, or it can also be because I produced more or less than I had expected. So if you plan for inventory, it's crucial to actually do an inventory monitoring and follow-up. Also, if you don't monitor and follow up the inventories kind of automatically increase. It happens by itself. Only if you monitor and report and follow up quite closely, that's the only way to keep the inventory close to the target that you have defined. So you need to do inventory reporting, you could say, on aggregates. What is the actual versus target in dollars, in euros, in turns, in days. But you also need to look at the inventory balance. Maybe the target was turns of 3, the actual turns are 3, but it's completely out of balance. Because for some products I have way too much, and for other products I have way not enough. So you also need to monitor the inventory balance. In the inventory monitoring, we typically also look, for instance, at rebalancing opportunities across the season. So how do I also make the best use of my inventory? And for sure, I also need to come to slow moving and write-offs. Typically from a finance perspective, we are obliged to monitor aging inventories. Write-offs are painful because we invested in the inventory and now we need to write it off. So that's a double cost. It's also an important topic or domain in a lot of companies because we basically want to avoid it. If you really want to avoid it, you need to do a better product lifecycle management, as we have shown in the overall S&OP process. But certainly in the inventory process, you need to have a good monitoring and follow-up of those inventories as well. Otherwise, you can run into troubles or into issues. So that's our inventory framework. If we need to deploy the inventory module, this is the framework we use to deploy it. 2 words on multi-echelon inventory optimization. Well, this is an example of a multi-echelon chain where I have regional DCs, I have a central DC. It's an example of the manufacturing of batteries. So I see I first manufacture here the batteries in bulk, and I also have packaging material, and the bulk batteries get into the packaging to have packed SKUs. And if I want to manufacture the batteries, I need some basic components. So this is an example of a multi-echelon production distribution network. And if we pick our first graph with the different layers and we put that into this type of multi-echelon context, what do we get? Well, basically you get something like this. We get here again the different levels in the supply chain. So I will have inventory of raw materials. I may have inventories of intermediates. The intermediates in this case are the batteries in bulk. I can have inventories in the central DC, and I can have inventories in the regional DC. And the multi-echelon question is really like, okay, how do I now balance these inventories and these different types of inventories? Because I can have safety stock, cycle stock, pipeline, build-up, strategic. How do I manage these different types of inventories across the different levels in the supply chain? And to give just one example, and then I will switch to Dan so they can give us a short demo of the single echelon functionality in Arqiva. Just to give one example, a typical question is like, okay, if you look at safety stocks, an input for safety stock is service level. And okay, if it's at the regional DC and if it's customer facing, I can still imagine like, okay, a higher or a lower service level is really affecting the customer. If you look at the central safety stock or the safety stock in the central DC, I see that a lot of companies struggle with the question here, like, but what's now a good service level from the central DC to the regional DC? And companies tell me, like, well, we use a target from the central DC to the regional DC of 90% or of 95%. And if I ask them, like, yeah, but where does that 90% come from? The answer typically is, well, we don't really know. That 90% has once been put there by a person who's probably no longer in the company. And multi-echelon really says, well, the 90% from the central DC towards the regional DC, that's only an internal service level. And multi-echelon will really ask, like, if I can now change that internal service level, if I can lower the internal service level, well, for sure, it will lower the central safety stock, but maybe I will need to increase the regional safety stock. So if I decrease the service level or the safety stock at the central DC, I will need to compensate for that at the regional DC. And the question is, how does this work? And what is now really the optimal central service level? Is it 90%? Is it 95%? Or is it 85%? How can I optimize my safety stocks across different steps in the supply chain? That's the multi-echelon question. And you can ask that question for safety stock, and you can ask comparable questions, for instance, for cycle stock. We will not dig in more detail here, but just wanted to clarify the difference between single echelon and multi-echelon before Dan starts with the demo. So Dan will show single echelon, so really look at one inventory point, but just that you know that we also have multi-echelon capabilities. We also have a vision paper which describes in more detail what multi-echelon is about. So if this is a topic of interest to you, don't hesitate, please reach out to us after this webinar, and we are most happy to schedule a follow-up call. Basically, we are ready to take some questions now. If you want to post a question, if you have your GoToMeeting screen, if you click it open, here you can just post a question. So we are most happy to hear your thoughts, share your opinions, or post a question on can you dig a bit more in detail on this or on that. Okay, see a first question coming up here. Does the Arqiva inventory module also work together with other planning systems? The answer is yes. Actually, I think that Arqiva has a quite strong inventory module. That inventory as a functionality is something which is often overlooked by other planning systems. And Arqiva is quite modular, so it's not like a monolithic system where you are really obliged to install all of the modules or install all of them at the same time. So it means that if you would currently have another system, we can easily work integrated with that existing system, or also as an Arqiva customer, if you want to start with a module and then gradually add other modules, that's how Arqiva basically has been built. Second question coming up here. How do you deal with the change managements, both towards the planners and towards the management? Starting with the management, how do you get your management convinced of doing stuff here? Well, we have different approaches. On the one hand, we have our Solventure Academy, where we give training. So basically, while we do this in a short webinar, having a training for your management and or planners on what are best practices and where do we need to change, that's certainly a way to drive change. A second topic is certainly the business case. If you want to spend money on more professional systems and define a project where you can use external support, you will need a business case. So towards the management, we have built business cases. We can do like offline calculations, basically the report that Dan has shown, like what is currently in your system, what is the proposal by Arqiva, where can we save inventory, where is the inventory not in balance, and we can call euro or dollar figures of potential savings, and this might help you to drive change towards the management and towards the planners. Well, if your planners have not worked with calculated inventory parameters and have been used to do their own thing in their own Excel file, change is important. And so if they have never used a decent tool before, don't immediately jump to multi-echelon, but take your time. Take some time to do pilots. So if they don't immediately trust the proposed calculations, what I sometimes say, if currently you are using 10 days and the tool proposes 3 days, then put 7 days in block stock so that the stock is not visible for the system, but it's still there. Try to work with the lower level of the 3 days. If the planner is convinced that it works, then he can unblock the 7 days, gradually consume it. But you really need time also for planners to adjust to more sophisticated ways of working, and it's something which for us as Solventure is very important. Okay, some other questions coming up here. Which inventory policy do you apply in Arqiva for high variable consumption? The theory is based on the normal distribution. In reality, we have log normal distribution or others. Well, good question, maybe a bit technical. I would tackle it from 2 ways. One, if your demand is highly variable, you need to have a tough discussion upfront with the salespeople whether it really makes sense to serve this type of product from inventory. So any possible way to get away from the peaks by doing VMI or by putting products on make to order, I think that's the best way to manage the inventory. If for one reason or another competitive pressure, you do need to put inventory, indeed, the normal distribution does not always apply, and Arqiva certainly has a library of different types of methods, including like the Poisson. I'm not sure if they today have the log normal, but my PhD was in inventory optimization. I surely have been discussing with them on log normal. So we do account for different types of methods for different types of demand patterns. How does Arqiva take into account economic production quantities? Well, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. You have the order quantities, you have production quantities. Production quantities, not sure if that's the technical question, but they do take into account a finite production rate. There again, we can take into account production rates to come to economic production quantities. It will make a proposal, and basically also what is the influence of the production quantity on the safety stock. Also, that is fully integrated into the Arqiva module. And maybe a last question. There's other questions coming in, but we will then follow up them separately with each of you individually. The dashboard shows overstock. Is it able to take into account projected demand? There is a demand signal that will consume the inventory 1 week later, so it's not actually overstock. Good question. It was not in the report shown. If you have the inventory module and the demand planning module, it's very easily to connect the two. If your demand would currently be managed in a different system, then there again, taking in the demand and then showing the projected demand, and then on the one hand using that to better understand overstocks and understocks, and secondly also being more aware of risks of non-moving stocking. If you have no demand but you still have inventory, what is the inventory at risk? So coupling the inventory to the demand is certainly an option. A very good remark or question. Unfortunately, we'll have to stop here. Time is up. See some other interesting questions coming up. Feel free to keep on posting them. We will come back with an answer, or we might do a separate follow-up. Also, if the questions that have been posted, if the answer was not fully to your satisfaction, or maybe we didn't understand exactly your question, after we close the webinar, you will get a pop-up with a short questionnaire where we basically solicit what did you like, what do we need to improve, and what are remaining questions. Post it in there. That will allow us to reach out to you, and we will follow up. So time is up. Thank you for attending this webinar. We will be back next month with extra webinars. Follow us on LinkedIn, or follow me on LinkedIn. You will see them passing by, and we will for sure hope to meet you back in one of those upcoming occasions.